Welcome to Journey Church Online. Whether you're watching via YouTube, Facebook, or journeyconnection.com, we're so glad you're here with us. Get ready for a message grounded in the Bible and relevant to your life. Our hope is you'll find it meaningful to your spiritual journey. We'd love to connect with you. If you'd like to learn more about our church, you can find details in the description below this video. If you want to worship through music played by the Journey Church Band, check out our worship playlist available 24/7 on our YouTube channel, Journey Church Roanoke. Thank you so much for joining us.
Peace, bring it all to peace. The storm surrounding me, let it break. At your name, still call the sea to still, the rage in me to still every wave. At your name, Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, breathe, call these bones to live, call these lungs to sing once again. I will praise Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, 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 you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, your name is a light that the shadows can't deny. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is alive, forever lifted high. Your name cannot be overcome. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, 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 your name is a light that the shadows can't deny. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is alive, forever lifted high. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is a light that the shadows can't deny. Your name
2 years ago was my 19th anniversary at the local television station where I was a photojournalist. The next day, I was fired. 2 months before that, my wife, of 17 years, had filed for divorce. It was the worst time of my life. I'm unemployed. I don't have a wife that was the most important thing in my life. It was just a helpless feeling. It felt, for the first couple of months, I mean, literally like there was someone standing on my chest. I just didn't know what to do. At 50 years of age and at the salary I was being paid, it was going to be next to impossible for me to find a job in broadcasting. I mean, everything that I do is centered around my sons. And my fear was, how am I going to be a provider if I don't have a job? So I had to have that wall of, on the outside everything's okay, but inside it's like, God, what is going to happen? How am I going to do this? I'd gotten to a point that I think I was down to $32. I mean, $32 in my name. So it was a desperate time, and just you never think that you're going to get to that point. I trusted that God had a plan, but I was just waiting to hear what that plan was. So my parents, who live in Pennsylvania, had asked if I come to Pennsylvania that they would give me a car. So they ended up buying me a brand new car, and they paid title registration and insurance for the first 6 months. So that was the start of the first blessing that was coming from this tragedy. During this time, I'm on food stamps. My church where I attended had called me and said, we know the AV ministry is like, why don't you come and see what you can do at the church? And getting this job at my church, they usually use volunteers. And for that season, they're like, we can pay you for this. The salary that they paid me was much more than I thought they would, but I was like, this is just a blessing. What I did during this time, and this was another thing that I told my boys, every time I got a check, and I would get a check every week from church, first 10% before I did anything is I paid God first. And I was telling the boys, I'm not doing this to try to extort God. I just want God to see that I trust him during this time. I'm at lunch with a friend of mine, and he was in a position was going to try to give me some work. So as I'm driving back, I had applied for some other jobs, and I get a phone call, and it's another television station, and they basically say, this is a Tuesday. They give me a call and said, you need to show up at this station on Thursday for training, and we'll pay you for the training, by the way. And I'm just shocked, and I hang up. It's like, I just got a job. They didn't ask me if I wanted the job. They basically told me to come and start working. God worked through my parents. God worked through the food stamps. God worked through my church, giving me a job so I could provide for my kids. At the end of this, in every prayer, and even to this day, I say, God, I trust you. I trust you that you're not going to leave us. You're not going to forsake us. I trust you that you're going to bring us through this in your time.
So, what do you do when times are tough? What do you do when life seems overwhelming and you're not sure where to turn? Do you turn to social media? You scroll and scroll through your news feed. You see anger and anxiety. You see divisiveness and discouragement. Do you turn to friends? You're struggling with a health issue. You're frightened. They may want to help, but there's only so much they can do. Do you turn to God? Do you believe that if you do that, all will automatically be made right with the world and all the turmoil in your life will be resolved? Whatever problems you're facing will immediately be overcome. Tough times come to every human being. There was a time when the Apostle Paul was suffering terribly. He begged the Lord, not once, not twice, but 3 times to make the suffering he was experiencing go away. Did it happen immediately the way Paul wanted? It did not. Does that mean God doesn't care when we go through difficult times? It does not. God did not ignore Paul in his time of struggle. Paul said God spoke to him. He said to me, "My grace is enough to cover and sustain you. My power is made perfect in weakness." In tough times, we may indeed feel weak. The word weakness here in the Greek language in which the New Testament was written can have the meaning of experiencing trials and troubles. If you're experiencing trials and troubles right now, raise your hand. Yeah. It can also have the meaning of questioning if you have the strength or capacity to deal with those trials and troubles. If you're questioning if you have the strength or capacity to deal with the trials and troubles in your life right now, raise your hands. Yeah. God says, if you truly trust in Him, when you're in that place, when you're in that space, God offers you grace enough to cover and sustain you. In the midst of trials and troubles, in the midst of questioning if you have the strength or capacity to deal with the tough times you're going through. What is grace? Grace is God's loving kindness, God's merciful kindness that exerts a holy influence on our souls and turns us to Christ, who then strengthens us by the power of His love. Do you need that kind of godly grace in your life today? If so, say, "I need God's grace." Say it, "I need God's grace." Now say, "I really need God's grace." Say it, "I really need God's grace." We're in a message series focused on the Old Testament prophet Elisha. He encounters a woman who really needed God's grace. She really needed God's loving kindness, God's merciful kindness. Listen, there was a woman whose husband belonged to the group of prophets. When her husband died, she called out to Elisha for help. She said, "Your servant, my husband, is dead. He served the Lord faithfully. My husband was in debt to a certain man. Now that man wants to take my 2 children to be his slaves." The woman was a widow whose life was falling apart. Her husband had been a devoted man of faith who had genuinely served the Lord, but he was now dead. And not only had he died in debt. This woman, who is now a single mom, is experiencing bereavement grief over the loss of her husband. And she is experiencing anticipatory grief as she is about to lose her 2 sons, not to death, but to slavery to a creditor. In that culture, at that time, if you owed money to someone, the creditor could legally come and take your children away to be temporary slaves. Now, it could not be forever. The length of time working as a slave to pay off a debt depended on the amount of the debt. So it may have been that the widow's 2 sons could have been enslaved for, say, 5 or 6 or 7 years. Can you imagine how devastating this would be to the widow? She would have no one to protect her or to provide for her. She feels like there's no hope for her. What does she do? She calls out to the prophet Elisha for help. Elisha said to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what things do you have in your house?" She said to Elisha, "Please, sir, I have nothing in the house. All I have is a small jar of olive oil." How does Elisha respond? Does he ignore her? No. Does he say, "Tough luck for you"? No. He asks her a simple question. "How can I help you?" That's a question those of us who are God's people should be asking others again and again. how can I help you? How can I help you? Not what can you do for me? Not what will you do to please me? But how can I help you? Can you imagine the difference it would make in the world if followers of Jesus were not so concerned with what we can get, not so concerned with what we want, not so concerned with what might inconvenience us? Can you imagine the difference it would make in the world if followers of Jesus were not so concerned if our lives are easy, but instead, if the first thing that comes to our minds is how we might help others? Is that the way you normally think? Really? Or is the first thing that normally comes to your mind how things are going to affect you? If we truly want to live godly lives, Elijah models for us the importance of focusing on how we might help others. Elijah demonstrates an important relational principle. Ask questions before making statements. Seek first to understand before seeking to be understood. Elijah asked a first question. How can I help you? Then he asked a second question. He asked, tell me, what things do you have in your house? Elijah asked, what you got? And how does the widow respond at first? She says, I have nothing. I have nothing. How many of us tend to say that when we feel overwhelmed? I have nothing to give. I have nothing and no one to depend on. I am at a loss. I have no answers. I have no solutions. I've got nothing. The widow thought there was no hope for her. She didn't have a husband. She didn't have a job, and soon she would not have her sons. She was upset, distraught, dismayed. She thought she had no resources at all. When we're hurting and afraid, how often do we tend to focus on what we don't have? We focus on the belief that there's nothing we have and there's nothing we can do to deal with the difficulty that confronts us. Our fears begin to overtake us. Here's what can happen with us over and over again. Fear can lead us to exaggerate our problems and misperceive our resources. If you didn't get the job you wanted, you may begin to think, well, I'm screwed for life. I'm trying the best I can. I guess I'm never going to amount to anything. I'm never going to get ahead. There may be multiple reasons you did not get a particular job at the time you wanted. But that doesn't mean that your life is ruined, that you have no value, that you're worth nothing, that you're not good enough. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but one of power, love, and sound judgment. Don't let fear overcome you. Trust in God's love to help you have sound judgment so you don't misperceive situations and become hopeless. Trust that God will empower you to move forward in faith even when life seems tough. Trust that God's grace is enough to sustain you. The widow did eventually realize that she did have something. She had a small jar of oil. It didn't seem like much of anything, but God can take a little and do a lot. In the Old Testament, David took a few small stones, and they became the means of killing the menacing giant Goliath because God's power was at work. In the New Testament, a few pieces of bread and a few fish became the means for thousands of people to be fed because God's power was at work. In the hands of God and with a little faith, God may do a lot. Elijah challenges the woman to take a small step of faith. Then Elijah said to her, go to all your neighbors. Ask them to lend you empty jars. Make sure that you get a lot of them. Then take the jars into your house. Go in with your sons and shut the door behind you. Pour the olive oil from your jar into all the other jars. When each jar is full, put it in a safe place." The widow left Elisha. She went into her house with her sons, and she shut the door behind her. They brought the jars to her, and she poured the oil into them. When all the jars were full, she said to one of her sons, "Bring me another jar." But he said, "There are no more jars." Elisha flips the script here. Instead of him asking her how he can help her, he instructs her to go and ask others for help. How many of us struggle with this? Me? Ask others for help? I don't think so. That would mean admitting I need help. That would mean admitting I can't do life all on my own. That would mean admitting I am weak in some way. Yes, but remember, God says, "My power is made perfect in weakness." God says, "My power is made perfect in the midst of the trials and troubles you're experiencing. My power is made perfect in the midst of you questioning if you have the strength or capacity to deal with those trials and troubles." When we refuse to admit we ever experience weakness, we're getting caught up in pridefulness. And when we're prideful, we close ourselves off to the help of God and of others. Recently, I was reading through a journal of mine from my college days. It brought up an uncomfortable memory for me. It reminded me of how at times I was called the machine and the robot because I was unwilling to share my emotions when I was struggling. I would just plunge ahead and focus on achieving and not really let anyone into my inner world. I would not be vulnerable and let them know of my feelings of fear and of my feelings of insecurity and of my feelings of not being good enough. It took years for me to admit those feelings. And it took years for me to admit my need for God, so the way I perceived myself might be transformed by the love and power of Christ at work in my life. I wouldn't admit it, but at that time in my life, I felt as empty as the jars the widow was instructed by Elisha to collect. In fact, when I was once asked to draw an image that represented my life, do you know what I drew? I drew an empty well, because that's how I perceived my life, empty. I thought I had nothing and no one. The reality was not that I had nothing. Instead, I had too much. I had a whole bunch of stuff I needed to empty out of my life before God would be at work in my life. I needed to empty myself of the need to look strong when in reality I felt weak. I needed to empty myself of the desire to control everything. I needed to empty myself of the sense of shame I carried around, feeling like I wasn't good enough. I needed to empty myself of the temptation to compare myself with others, which sucked the joy out of life from me. Will you be honest? What do you need to empty out of your life before God will be at work in your life? Do you need to empty yourself of arrogant pride? Do you need to empty yourself of greed? Do you need to empty yourself of selfish pleasure seeking? Do you need to empty yourself of self-righteousness? Do you need to empty yourself of envy? Do you need to empty yourself of out of control anger? Romans 12:2 says, "Don't be like the people of this world, but let God change the way you think. Then you will know how to do everything that is good and pleasing to Him." when we empty ourselves of our sin and selfishness, and we allow God to change us so we become more Jesus-like, God may be at work in amazing ways. In her emptiness, the widow decided to take the risk of faith and to step out in faith. She actually went to her neighbors and she asked for the help, and she collected lots and lots of empty jars. She decided she wasn't going to let fear control her. She released her worry to God, and God released His power to be at work. God showed up in a miraculous way. She need not be overwhelmed. She need not be overcome. She was not alone. The widow did not give in to self-pity and do nothing. She, in faith, did her part. She unleashed a genuine faith in God, and God unleashed God's power. God acted to meet the real need she was experiencing as she went through a tough time in life. After she told Elijah what had happened, he said, "Sell the oil and use part of the money to pay what you owe the man. You and your sons can live on what is left." Elijah was forthright. Pay what you owe. Don't fail to pay those with whom you've run up a debt. Meet your financial obligations. Then the prophet of God said, "You and your sons can live on what is left." Is this where a lot of us struggle? We don't want to live on what's left. We want more and more, and that's what gets us into debt in the first place and what brings tough times to a lot of us. Do we need to pray fervently that we might receive from God a spirit of sound judgment? And do we need to act in ways that show sound judgment? Because when we fail to do that, time and time again, we bring tough times on ourselves. The widow trusted that God would empower her to move forward in faith even when life seems so terribly tough. She trusted that God's grace was enough to sustain her. How about you? Do you trust that God is enough to help you with whatever you're facing in life? Well, do you? Let's pray together. God of love, God of mercy, God of grace. So many of us need to know your power and presence in our lives. So many of us are going through tough times, and we're experiencing anxiety and worry and fear. Some of us feel enslaved to things that keep bringing us down. We feel enslaved to selfishness and sin, and we keep making wrong decisions again and again, and it makes things worse for us. Lord, help us to admit our need for you. Help us to begin to see things the way you see things, to think the way you want us to think, that we can see life filled with lots of opportunities, and there are chances that you put before us, and you call us to take a step of faith so that our lives might be different. Some of us may have trouble admitting our need and reaching out to you, God, or to anyone else for help. But we desperately need that. So, Lord, I'm praying for the moving of the Holy Spirit in our lives to challenge us, to convict us, and comfort us as we need, that we might follow you with full and free hearts, and we might be released from some of the anxiety and worry and upset that seems to plague us. God, help us to take the chance to truly follow you with all of who we are. We pray this in the name, strength, and power of Jesus. Amen. We're so glad that you are being a part of this series of Journey Church called Take a Chance. And if you would be willing to take a chance to let us connect with you online, we'd love to do that. So we invite you to go to our website, journeyconnection.com. and click on the eConnect link there. Let us know how we might pray for you. Let us know how we might encourage you. Let us know how we might connect you in some way. If there's something that we might, as a church family, do to help you know that there are resources available to help you when you're going through a tough time, we'll be happy to make those referrals. So go to our website to do that. Or while you're there, you can connect through the e-giving link and make a contribution financially. Because when you give, you make a difference. God uses your gift. God takes a little and can do great things. God can do a lot. So we invite you to do that. When you do, you bless the lives of people at Journey Church, but you also bless some of our ministry partners. And when you give, a portion of what you give goes to those ministry partners, and one of them is called International Justice Mission. And what they do is they free people who are enslaved. They rescue young women who are being sex trafficked. When you give to Journey, a portion of that we give to them, and you can free the captives, and you can make a difference with your giving. We invite you to do that. Take a chance. Be generous. Be give. Take a chance. Be back with us again next week as we continue in this series. God bless.